sheet went. There we go. So again, we're going to learn about a war you've never heard of. We should know where it happened. And where it happened was mostly in the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire, something we've certainly heard of before. It was founded by Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great. And Charlemagne, part of what made him successful, he had a good sense of timing, it would seem. He founded the empire on Christmas Day in the year 800. So, a memorable day and a year that's a good round number. But the other thing we need to remember is the empire didn't do so well a couple of generations after Charlemagne died. Remember, it's split into thirds, but it does kind of get cobbled back together. But in this cobbled together form, most common thing you'll hear from a historian if you ask about the Holy Roman Empire, if you ask for a quick summary, they would say it was neither holy nor Roman nor really much of an empire. But if you're a big fan of the empire, like Kendra is a huge fan of the Holy Roman Empire, right, Kendra? Total fan. We've seen you wear the t-shirt, right? Right, Ambrielle? Seen her wear her Holy Roman Empire t-shirt, big fan. Right. It lasts more than 1,000 years. It's founded in 800. It really doesn't die until Napoleon kills it about 1,000 years later. Now, for a visual of where it is, this is it. Right? And it is big. It's got all of today's Germany. It's got a big sliver of Poland, big sliver of France, the northern chunk of what is now Italy. It's got Austria, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium. There's a lot there. We also need to visualize the war to understand. It's the 30 Years' War. It's not the most creative name for a war because it gets its name due to the fact that it lasts about 30 years. But I want you to have a sense of the scale in terms of the number of countries fighting it, how land changes hands, how participants in the war drop in and out of the fighting. And for that, what we've got is an animated map that kind of reflects updates in the war every fortnight. Not the fun. Yes. Let's speed this up. Oh, we'll get to what those two colors represent, but what you need to know for now is that obviously those are the two opposing sides of the war. You notice at some points it dies down, but as the caption will tell you, it picks back up. we get close to the end, think about that center part that is the Holy Roman Empire, kind of what's been happening there. Yes, you may. Okay, so yeah, I don't know about the music. I did not make the animation. The person who went all the work to do that, I figure it's the least we can do is let them pick the soundtrack. The point of looking at is to understand the number of combatants and also the tremendous back and forth of that war. That back and forth represents, again, some countries dropping in and out of the fighting, but it also represents the tide of battle in favor of the blue or in favor of the red. When you have that much back and forth, it's caused by battles, and battles result in battle deaths. And that's 450,000 battle deaths. At this point, some of you may be thinking, well, in a war, aren't they all battle deaths? No. An additional 4 to 12 million people were killed by other causes that were related to the conflict, the actual battle. One of those is disease. Until we get to the 20th century, disease is always the biggest killer in war, even among soldiers. It's not actual fighting, it's disease. In addition to disease, famine is another major killer. This is a time period. So this is a time before we have canned food, refrigeration, freezers. We certainly don't have the U.S. military's MREs, the meals ready to eat. Armies have to live off the land, and living off the land actually means taking stuff from local people. And if you take stuff from local people, they don't have anything to eat, and they starve. Okay. Now, for the Pear Deck, I just want you to answer. There are no wrong answers. There are several different things that can be right answers. Why do you think that estimate for war-related casualties is so high or so fuzzy, ranging from 4 million to a number 3 times that big? Javante, let's make sure that hood stays down. That phone, now that your back needs to be away. If you need to plug it in, you can plug it in over here, but not on your computer. Yep. Okay, let's see what you guys came up with. Okay, yeah, so hard to tell why people died. I mean, this is not an era where we get certificates of death and people are examined by a doctor. We don't have obituaries printed in newspapers. Yes, part of it is the distance in time. Just as long ago as it was, we just don't have records. And yeah, we didn't have countries where there are people whose only job is to keep these kind of statistics. All right. Nicely done. Another reason that First Hour pointed out is people may have moved, right? You didn't know if somebody was dead or if they had run away from the war and were just living somewhere else. So it's hard for us to know. But what these deaths represent, by most estimates, is 1 in 5 Europeans are killed as a result of this war. And in some of the worst hit places, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire, what's now Germany, especially 60% of the population may have been killed by the war. So 3 out of every 5 people. Now, to digest that, we need some context. And so we're going to compare the death toll of the 30 Years' War to the World Wars. And to do that, some of this I want to ask you based on your impressions, because you guys have heard about World War I, at least in some other classes. You probably heard about the influenza pandemic. So based on your impression from what you know about those things, what percentage of the European population do you think was killed by World War I and the pandemic that came right after it? All right. So the plurality going for the bigger numbers, with only 2 people on the lower end of the scale. Well, the answer is that those of you that picked 5% were the closest. Roughly 6% of the European population was killed. I had to do some calculations to figure that out, so it is a rough estimate. But 6% is not even a third of 20%. And it's a tenth of the 60% death tolls in some parts of Europe during the 30 Years' War. Well, what about World War II? World War II is bigger. Yes. Thank you. Important. And World War II is bigger. And in global terms, estimates are that 3% of the world's population may have died as a result of World War II. And that is massive. But we can't just think about it globally, because in that war, there were some countries that were barely touched by the conflict itself. Lots of Americans died in World War II, but almost all of them died outside of the United States. The United States only had really small attacks on its own territory. Yeah, I mean, Pearl Harbor, it gets a lot of attention, and it should, but in the grand scheme of that conflict, the casualties suffered by the Japanese and American forces in Pearl Harbor were very small. Right? South America left out of the war, right, for the most part. So let's look at the places that were hardest hit. And the Soviet Union, in terms of the sheer number of deaths, was the most injured by the fighting. It may have lost between 20 and 27 million of its people to the war. All right, so we've got a big number there. What percentage do you think that represents, Tevian, of the Soviet population? We'll just take... All right. That 20 to 27 million people is a big number, but it is 13%. Oh. Sorry, it will go up on the screen. And the Soviet Union may have had the most people killed, but in terms of proportions, Poland suffered the most. Nearly 1 in 5 of its people was killed by the war, partly because of the Holocaust and Poland's large pre-war Jewish population. That's a huge part of that story. But the Poles were also caught between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So, very bad for Poland. But still, only in Poland do we get close, really close to that 20% mark that we see for the 30 Years' War. Why was the 30 Years' War so bad? Well, one, it may have been the first total war in the history of the world. Usually, World War I gets the credit for that. And it is the first total war that occurs in industrialized societies. But I think the 30 Years' War matches that definition. A total war has two elements that make it a total war. One, the sides that are fighting are using all of the resources they've got, all of their people, all of their wealth, all of their natural resources, anything they can use goes to the conflict, goes to fighting. And because it's a total war and all the sides are using everything they've got, everybody's a target for the enemy. Usually, we think of the proper targets in a war as the people who have the weapons, right? The combatants, the soldiers. But in a total war, when I say everyone, I mean everyone, and that includes civilians. People who are growing crops on farms, working in a factory, anything. They are targets. And that was certainly how things went in the 30 Years' War. And as an example, we're going to look at something Sweden did. We're going to look at a couple of things Sweden did. This is the first. Now, you guys may have seen some weird things already if you were paying attention to the animated video. It talked about Denmark restarting the war in 1624. And Vance might be thinking, isn't Denmark like the Lego people? Aren't they too busy doing fun, nice things like making new overpriced Lego sets to get into trouble? Well, they are now, but they weren't then. And Sweden, well, Aiden might be thinking, I think Sweden, they just like make really safe cars and IKEA furniture, and I think that's kind of it, right? Lingonberry jam, maybe, if we think of Sweden. But in this time period, Sweden is a great power and a very important military power. Their king was a warrior king, not like a Viking, but kind of like a modern day version, and he led armies into battle. And so Sweden definitely did stuff, and they did some pretty bad stuff. In Germany, they destroyed over 2,000 castles, which they could do because by this point we have cannons, and gunpowder-driven projectiles from cannons are devastating to castles. They destroyed 18,000 villages, and 1,500 towns. Towns, if you're wondering what's the difference between a town and a village, well, obviously, towns are bigger. You probably figured that part out. Towns would also usually have a wall around them. And if you're thinking, well, that's not that many towns, especially compared to 18,000 villages, but it represents 1 in 3 towns in Germany being destroyed. And this image can help you understand why, just how bad the destruction was, but also in terms of how we don't get counts. People are just left dead wherever. And total war also meant not only that there were many deaths, but that the deaths were also pretty gruesome. We're going to look at one example of another thing that Sweden did. In 1631, they sacked Magdeburg. Sacked means like to ransack. Not just to conquer it, but to break stuff, kill people you don't need to, steal things that aren't yours. They killed 24,000 people. And most of them died pretty drawn out and horrible deaths because most of them burned to death while they were trapped in their houses. That just to show you it's not all about picking on the Swedes. Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, he was particularly vicious. When he found what he viewed as rebels in this conflict, he executed them. But he didn't just do that, he mutilated them. He chopped off their right hands. Then he disemboweled them, so like cut open their abdomen and removed their guts. And as you can see, also hanging people from trees for other people to see was a part of this. And if you have, that will be okay.
Can you go back, sir?
That's all right. So who are these two sides? And so far you only would kind of know them as Team Red and Team Blue. You might be wondering, well, maybe it was the Mongols fighting. I mean, they did some invading of Europe, and so maybe the Europeans are fighting against the Mongols. Maybe it's another Christians versus Muslims. And it could be, because there are certainly Muslim forces in what is now Europe. There still are to some extent, but in this time period, the Turkish empires, they've got a lot of territory in southeastern Europe, so it could be that, but it isn't. It isn't either of those things. This is a religious war of Christians versus other Christians. It works out to be primarily the Habsburgs, who are the people who are running the Holy Roman Empire, versus the anti-Habsburgs. They're kind of everybody else. But it's still Christian versus Christian conflict. So what were they fighting about? A lot of this is because of the Protestant Reformation, in terms of where the religious motivation came from. We'll spend some more time on this, but I do want to go ahead and introduce it today. The key figure that kicks this off is Martin Luther. He's not the only one, but he's the most important figure. He was a monk. He was Catholic. But he had some important disagreements with the church. One, he was angry about something called indulgences. And indulgences were a pardon for sin that you could buy from the church. So if maybe Rain has stolen something, Rain can confess to the theft, pay a little bit of money, and the church will issue an official pardon for that sin. So Rain can be back on track to get to heaven. And church leaders got a lot of money by selling these, but they didn't just use it for churchly kinds of things. They often used it to live comfortably, have fancy stuff. one of the ways to think about this is it was okay to party hardy as long as you paid up for your party. Okay, and that's where we'll leave it today. We'll pick up with that tomorrow. Well, not tomorrow, but Thursday. Remember, no